You were small when the silence became louder than words, when every unreturned glance etched itself into your nervous system. Neglect was not a single event, but a climate, a constant weather of dismissal that carved your mind into a landscape of absence. What does it mean to grow up unseen and yet feel watched by the void that absence leaves behind? An ignored child learns early that attention is currency, but theirs is counterfeit. Developmental psychology calls this insecure attachment. When the caregiver is physically present, but emotionally vacant, the child's nervous system twists into patterns of hypervigilance and despair. You grew up scanning faces for signs, tilting your entire identity toward the impossible task of earning notice. Each failed attempt confirmed a brutal equation: love equals performance, worth equals usefulness. But when no amount of effort summoned recognition, the silence did not stay outside. It grew inside you, becoming the voice that tells you you are invisible, even when someone stares directly into your eyes. And if you never mattered then, how could you possibly matter now? Neglect corrodes memory differently than abuse. Abuse leaves scars that scream, but neglect leaves blank spaces where identity should have formed. Research on child development shows that consistent mirroring, being noticed, named, responded to, builds the scaffolding of a self. Without it, you never quite know if your feelings belong to you, or if they exist at all. You begin to treat your own emotions like strangers knocking at a door you're not sure you own. Every silence you endured became a lesson. Your needs are interruptions, your presence is excessive, your voice is noise. The ignored child grows into the adult who erases themselves preemptively. But if you learn to disappear so completely, how can you ever be certain you exist? Attention is not just comfort, it is neurological wiring. Studies in developmental psychology show that when a child is unseen, their brain's reward circuits dull, while their stress systems ignite. Cortisol, the hormone of threat, becomes the bloodstream's daily companion. You mistake stillness for safety, but your body never stops scanning for danger that never arrives, for love that never comes. Neglect doesn't vanish when you grow. It calcifies into your physiology, your heartbeat carrying the memory of every ignored cry. You become addicted to invisibility, yet terrified of it, chasing recognition only to recoil when it's offered. And in that loop, a question sharpens. If your nervous system was trained in emptiness, how could it ever trust fullness without tearing itself apart? Self-improvement preaches visibility. Speak louder, take space, assert yourself. But for the ignored child, visibility is a punishment. You learned early that to be noticed was either meaningless or dangerous, so you perfected the art of erasure. Psychology calls this learned helplessness, the conditioning that convinces you effort is useless, so you stop trying altogether. You sit in rooms like a ghost, rehearsing silence, swallowing entire conversations before they form. Even when you attempt self-expression, your voice fractures into apologies, disclaimers, hesitations. The ignored child does not fail to grow. They grow inward, collapsing into a hollow architecture of survival. But if every attempt to be seen collapses back into invisibility, what part of you is left that anyone could actually recognize? Neglect shapes the internal critic with more precision than cruelty ever could. When no one responds to you, the mind invents its own authority, a constant internalized parent whose gaze never softens. This is introjection, the process of turning the absence of care into an internal law. Instead of asking for love, you scold yourself for needing it. Instead of reaching outward, you retreat inward, where a voice repeats, "Why would anyone care?" That voice becomes so constant that silence feels unbearable unless it is filled with your own self-condemnation. The ignored child learns to punish themselves before anyone else can ignore them again. But if your worth is only measured by how efficiently you disappear, can you ever truly find out who you are? Emotional neglect creates an illusion of independence. Others admire your self-sufficiency, your ability to function without complaint. But psychology warns, this is not resilience, it is compulsive self-reliance. You trained yourself to never need, because needing meant disappointment, rejection, shame. You became caretaker, problem solver, listener, anything but the fragile child who once reached out and found only air. Yet this independence is brittle. Beneath it lies a constant fear. If you ever let the mask slip, if you ever admit you are not unbreakable, everyone will scatter just as they did before. And so you hold the weight of your own silence, pretending it is strength. But if every connection depends on your invisibility, are you ever truly connected at all? Attachment theory describes the ignored child's adult relationships as paradoxes, longing for intimacy while recoiling from it. You crave closeness, yet the moment someone draws near, panic blooms. Their attention feels foreign, almost violent, because your nervous system was tuned to absence, not presence. The result is a cycle. You chase love until it approaches, then sabotage it to restore the familiar loneliness. You call it self-protection, but it is repetition compulsion. Your psyche reenacting the only script it knows. You test others, push them away, then ache when they leave. In this loop, you are both abandoned and the abandoner. But if every embrace feels suffocating and every distance feels lethal, how can you ever escape the gravitational pull of neglect? Silence in childhood does not stay contained. It leaks into language itself. Research in developmental psychology shows that neglected children often struggle with alexithymia, the inability to name emotions. You may feel the ache of sadness, the spike of anger, the tremor of fear, yet the words dissolve before reaching your tongue. Language becomes a betrayal. It cannot hold what was never mirrored back to you. Instead, you speak in fragments, in metaphors, in half-truths that never quite land. Conversations feel like translation exercises between a self you cannot articulate and a world that demands clarity. You are fluent in silence, but illiterate in need. And if you cannot name what you feel, how can you ever know if it was real at all? Neglect does not simply erase affection, it distorts time. Studies in trauma psychology reveal that the ignored child often develops dissociation, a drifting away from the present moment. Days blur into one another, years collapse into hazy fragments, because no one anchored your memories with acknowledgement. Without witness, time itself becomes unreliable. You may recall entire periods of your life as blank, or revisit old moments so vividly they override the present. You exist in suspended animation, forever waiting for the recognition that never arrives. Time stretches when you are unseen, because absence has no measure. And so your life feels both too short and unbearably long, as if you've been rehearsing an existence that never fully began. But how can you measure a life that no one ever marked? The ignored child often becomes the adult with an insatiable drive for achievement. Psychology calls it compensatory striving, the frantic attempt to fill an internal void with external validation. You chase grades, promotions, accomplishments, each one a desperate message in a bottle. Do you see me now? But recognition is a mirage. Applause fades faster than silence, and each achievement only deepens the hollowness it was meant to repair. The world may call you successful, yet inside you feel fraudulent, empty, undeserving. This is the paradox of neglect. You become hyper-visible in pursuit of proof, while still believing you are invisible at the core. And if no achievement can ever rewrite the story of your childhood, what are you really striving for? Success, or simply the hope of existing? Neglect breeds perfectionism like mold and shadow. Clinical psychology describes it as conditional worth, the belief that you are acceptable only if flawless. You learned that mistakes were not corrected with guidance, but met with indifference. So, you crafted a self that leaves no room for error. Every action becomes a performance, every word rehearsed, every flaw concealed under layers of control. Yet perfection does not bring safety. It only sharpens the terror of being exposed. You live under the tyranny of an invisible audience, one that never claps, never forgives, never even looks. The ignored child polishes themselves into transparency, flawless but unseen. But if perfection guarantees only invisibility, what is the purpose of all this endless, exhausting refinement? Psychologists speak of emotional numbing, a defense where the body learns to dull every feeling to avoid pain. For the ignored child, numbness becomes second nature. Joy feels muted, grief feels distant, even love arrives as if wrapped in gauze. You tell yourself you are calm, but it is not peace, it is absence. When neglect taught you that expressing need was useless, your mind silenced the signals altogether. But numbness is never total. It leaks through in restless nights, in sudden irritability, in the inexplicable heaviness that clings to ordinary moments. You are neither fully alive nor fully dead, trapped in a gray middle ground where nothing can reach you. And if you can no longer feel the full spectrum of living, are you truly living at all? Relationships become mirrors that reflect neglect back at you. Research on attachment trauma shows that children who were ignored often gravitate toward partners who repeat the pattern: distant, withholding, inconsistent. You mistake neglect for love because your nervous system confuses the familiar with the safe. Each unanswered text, each withheld embrace, reactivates the old wound, and you tell yourself this must be what connection feels like. The cycle tightens. You chase, they retreat. You beg, they withdraw. You call it passion, intensity, fate, but it is simply repetition. The ignored child grows into the adult who reenacts their own erasure. But if every love you find only deepens the silence, how can you ever separate affection from abandonment? Neglect leaves you starving for validation, yet incapable of digesting it. When someone finally offers praise, kindness, or care, you recoil. Clinical psychology calls this cognitive dissonance, the clash between what is given and what you believe you deserve. Compliments feel like lies, love feels like pity, support feels like a setup for betrayal. You nod politely, but inside, you dismantle every word until nothing remains. The child who once begged to be seen now disbelieves anyone who claims to see them. It is safer to reject care and risk discovering it was never real. But if you cannot accept proof when it is handed to you, what evidence could ever convince you that you were worthy in the first place? Neglect embeds itself in the body as deeply as in the mind. Somatic psychology shows that ignored children often carry chronic tension, shallow breathing, restless sleep. The body remembers what the mind tried to forget: the long nights waiting for footsteps that never came, the hunger for comfort that stayed unsatisfied. Each muscle clenches as if still bracing for an absence. Each heartbeat carries the rhythm of being overlooked. You call it anxiety, fatigue, stress, but it is neglect, fossilized into flesh. The ignored child never truly outgrows the silence. They wear it under their skin. And if even your body has become a monument to being unseen, how could you ever inhabit yourself without feeling like an empty house? Memory researchers describe neglect as leaving behind implicit memories, the kind stored in sensation, mood, and reaction, not in narrative. You may insist your childhood was fine, yet your body flinches at indifference. Your chest tightens at silence. Your skin crawls when ignored. These are not stories you can tell. They are echoes you cannot silence. The ignored child carries an invisible archive, a museum of absence where each exhibit is a missing piece. You walk through life haunted by what never happened, by the conversations that never took place, by the embraces that never came. You are shaped not by presence, but by void. But if your past is written entirely in what was missing, what kind of future can you possibly construct? Neglect creates a distorted mirror of the self. Social psychology describes this as reflected appraisal, the way you form your identity through the responses of others. But when others barely respond, the mirror is blank. You grow into adulthood, asking not, "Who am I?" but "Do I exist?" You adopt roles, personas, masks, desperately scanning faces for a flicker of recognition. Yet every reflection feels counterfeit, as though you are impersonating yourself. The ignored child never truly becomes. They only perform becoming. Each identity you construct collapses under its own fragility, leaving you exposed again to the same hollow question that followed you from childhood. If no one ever reflected you back, how can you know the difference between who you are and who you pretend to be? Neglect is rarely loud enough to be believed. Abuse leaves evidence, bruises, screams, records, but neglect leaves nothing but absence, an injury invisible even to the one who carries it. Clinical accounts describe this as the hidden wound, a trauma without proof. You tell your story, and others shrug at least nothing bad happened. Yet nothing happening was the wound itself. You learn to doubt your own suffering, gaslighting yourself before anyone else can. The silence becomes a conspiracy between you and the world, where neither acknowledges the damage. You are both victim and denier, living in a house where the walls never collapse, but never shelter either. And if your pain is dismissed even by your own voice, how do you ever confirm it was real? The ignored child becomes an expert in overfunctioning. Developmental psychology notes this as parentification when the child takes on adult roles, caring for others while their own needs rot in silence. You learn to soothe, to manage, to fix, because no one did it for you. And so adulthood becomes a repetition of caretaking. Friends, partners, colleagues, everyone receives the comfort you were denied. They call you dependable, strong, selfless. But beneath the praise lies depletion, a bone-deep exhaustion. You are both rescuer and abandoned, both healer and unhealed. Each act of giving erases you further, until you exist only in the service of others. But if you are always the one holding everyone else, who is left to hold you? Neglect hardens into shame, a core belief etched so deeply it feels like truth. Psychologists describe toxic shame as the conviction that you are fundamentally flawed, not because of what you did, but because of what you are. The ignored child concludes, if no one responded, it must be because I was unworthy of response. Shame then becomes the lens through which every interaction is filtered. A laugh feels mocking, a pause feels condemning, a glance feels like evidence. You no longer question whether you were neglected. You question whether you ever deserved care in the first place. And shame, unlike guilt, cannot be repaired by action. It simply lingers, a permanent verdict. But if your very existence feels like an error, what part of you is left untouched by condemnation? Neglect teaches you to live in anticipation, always waiting for the moment when things will shift, when someone will finally notice. Psychologists call this deferred hope, the belief that the future will deliver what the past withheld. You build your life like a waiting room, filling it with distractions, achievements, rituals, but never truly entering the present. You're always one promotion away, one relationship away, one moment away from being enough. Yet the moment never arrives, because the script was written long before you could read it. The ignored child grows into the adult who lives perpetually almost there. And if every moment of now is sacrificed to an imagined arrival, when do you actually start living? Neglect does not simply vanish, it mutates. Trauma theorists describe it as repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to recreate the original wound in new forms. You find yourself drawn to cold workplaces, unresponsive friends, distant lovers, because their indifference feels eerily familiar. It is not that you enjoy the pain. It is that your nervous system recognizes it as home. You replay neglect again and again, hoping each time it will end differently, that this time the silence will break. But it never does. The ignored child rehearses the same script with new actors, each performance ending in the same void. And if you are doomed to repeat what destroyed you, can you ever escape? Or are you simply living inside an echo chamber of your own erasure? The ignored child eventually learns to mistrust even their own perception. Cognitive psychology calls this self-doubt internalization, the chronic belief that your feelings are exaggerations, distortions, or lies. When no one confirmed your reality, you learn to discredit it yourself. You feel sadness, but tell yourself it is weakness. You feel anger, but insist it is irrational. You feel longing, but dismiss it as childish. Slowly, you amputate each emotion until nothing is left but uncertainty. You become your own skeptic, your own veneer, your own silencer. The cruelest part of neglect is not that others ignored you. It is that you now ignore yourself with even greater precision. But if you can no longer believe your own reality, what reality is left to believe in? Neglect creates not only wounds, but an entire worldview. Developmental psychology shows that children generalize their earliest experiences into global assumptions. People don't care. The world won't respond. My voice is meaningless. These beliefs calcify into adulthood, filtering every interaction. A friend's delay becomes rejection. A partner's distraction becomes abandonment. Even silence in a room feels like proof. You don't just believe you are ignored. You believe existence itself is indifferent. The child's unanswered cries become the adult's philosophy of futility. You call it realism, but it is simply neglect turned into a religion of despair. And if every gesture, every glance, every silence is interpreted through the lens of being unseen, how could you ever recognize love even if it stood directly in front of you? There is a moment quiet, unannounced, when the pattern of neglect completes its work. It is not dramatic, not cinematic. It is a slow implosion, a collapse of distinction between outside and inside. The ignored child grows into an adult who no longer searches for witnesses, because the absence has become the only witness. You do not crave recognition. You crave disappearance. Your thoughts turn recursive, your memories folding inward until even pain loses shape. You are both the unseen and the one who refuses to see. What began as a survival strategy ends as a worldview, the belief that reality itself is indifferent, that you were born into a silence too vast to ever break. And if even your perception of reality has been trained to vanish, how can you ever be sure you are here at all?